to admonish one another. Proverbs 3, verses 24 through 26. When you lie down, you shall not be, yea,
There's a big government scandal going on that you need to know about it. The government is actually stealing money from unsuspecting property owners. Let me explain. Every day the government forecloses on 3,000 or more property owners because they've fallen behind on their property taxes. This amounts to roughly $14 million in tax foreclosures every single day. Let me give you a specific example. Let's say someone
Building your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single integrated platform. Add
Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. Any amount is very much appreciated, and I humbly thank you.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American.
This means, in the case of an American Negro, it comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you, that the Indians were you, that the Indians were you, that the Indians were you.
I was up in Pine Ridge with Russell Means at the Sun Dance.
One of my dearest friends.
I took my wife and my son. My son knew how to go.
Later moved to much larger areas of land, and they too moved west, resettling all over the state of Oklahoma. The more commonly known signs of resistance came from the most recently established Cherokee tribe, originally known as the Ane-Yanwea tribe of the Great Lakes. They later moved to much larger areas of landmass, stretching throughout the southernmost regions of North America. According to historical records, these group of native Indians were called the Salagi tribe before the late 1700s, a detached tribe of the Iroquoian family. It's an open secret that the term Cherokee is a Creek word, meaning people who spoke a different language. The Salagi later adopted Cherokee as their new tribal name during the 1820s, while simultaneously revamping themselves by creating their own new form of tribal government based on the United States laws and regulations. This was all done to counteract against ceding their full territory. Rather
This is how
What is Bass Pro Shops doing with the giant pyramid in Memphis? If you're new to my channel, then you might not know that I'm a strong advocate of the true Holy Land being here in North America. This is because, other than this pyramid in Memphis, we can find plenty mounds or pyramids built by the indigenous living up and down the Mississippi River. They are called the Mound Builders. Also in the Grand Canyon, they are still uncovering an ancient Egyptian civilization far more ancient than the one that mainstream education and media perpetuates. With that being said, Egypt is called by two names other than Egypt. In Aramaic and Hebrew, they call it Mitzrayim.
I feel like something's coming. In 2024, your life and your business won't be the same anymore. A new technology that's going to change everything. Oh my God, we're not ready for this. Co-pilot. There's nothing it
People today might not like to hear the word slavery, especially when they see what ISIS did to Yazidi women when they were slaves a long time ago. But don't be surprised if this was a usual thing to do in the past, even though things are very different now. Slavery is one of the oldest human practices. Not only is it one of the oldest, but it is also one of the most common. Almost every historical culture, from Sumer to Babylon to Egypt, had slaves. Even though it has been around for a long time, slavery is still a secondary problem that is rarely studied. There is also a study of slavery, which focuses a lot on farm slavery in the New World, especially in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. Not much has been written about slavery in the past of Islam. In fact, Muslim historians often think of the problem as a touchy one. So, slavery has never been a part of the great history of the Islamic world. Slavery in the Middle East. In the past, most slaves were owned by kings, religious leaders, and other important people. A few slaves were owned separately. Often they were taken from war prisoners and then used to farm lands and care for royal herds. Even though divine faiths have grown in the Middle East, it is interesting that slavery still exists. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three divine faiths, all agree that slavery exists. By the time the Prophet Muhammad started spreading Islam in the 7th century, slavery was a well-established and widely accepted part of life in Arabia. In fact, at that time, the slave trade path started in Sudan and Somalia and ended in Arabia and Egypt. So it's not surprising that Muhammad accepted slavery and saw it as an important part of the complex social system of his time. The Prophet was more of a reformer than a rebel when it came to slavery. He didn't plan to end slavery completely anytime soon. Instead, her goal was to make slaves' lives better by being kind to them. During Hajj and Dah, the Prophet showed again how he felt about slavery by telling slaves to get food and clothes while their masters got food and clothes. When masters couldn't take care of their slaves, they had to set them free. Since slavery had been around for a long time in the Middle East, it made sense at the time that there wasn't a more bold way to end it. Slaves have become an important part of the Arab economy and way of life in Arabia itself. The end of slavery had a big effect on society, and it wasn't impossible for things to get out of hand. In the end, there was no effort to end slavery, so it continued to grow during the Islamic era. Under Islamic law, there are two ways to make someone your slave. The first comes from jihad, which means holy war, and the second comes from people whose parents were slaves. So when a slave couple had a child, the kid was automatically a slave. These two ways were used to make sure that only non-Muslims were made slaves. During the spread of Islam in the 1st century, jihad became one of the most important ideas. During this time, many places were quiet, but there was also an unanswered question. Was the holy goal of jihad still the main reason for all of these advances? Or was getting loot and slaves the main reason? This question became the starting point for a lot more study, especially during the time when Islam grew after the Prophet died. The development of the slave system. Over time, these two ways of getting slaves were joined by buying and selling slaves. This didn't go against the Quran, and Muawiyah, the first ruler of the Umayyads, started it. Since then, more slaves have been sold in the Islamic world. In this buying and selling, the price of slaves is based on whether they are male or female. Castrated guys cost the most, and young white women cost the next most. Islam says that slave owners can't use female slaves for their own benefit or force them to become whores. Before Islam, slavery and prostitution were popular in the Middle East. This is a very important change. Still, Islam gave bosses a break by letting them have sexual relations with slaves. As concubines, they got to eat better and wear nicer clothes. They don't have to do housework either, so all they have to do is serve their lord. The rulers of the Islamic Empire at the time not only used these female slaves as concubines, but they also gave them as gifts. As part of the political process, slaves were sometimes given as gifts. Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of Ifriqiya, gave slaves as gifts as a way to get along with other people. He also helped catch about 300,000 Berbers and the rest of the North African Berber tribes. Some of this huge number of slaves were put to work in the army. Some were given to the kings of Egypt and Damascus as slaves, and the rest were sold. Slavery seems hard to separate from the growth of Islamic culture, since it was still an important part of people's lives when Islam reached its golden age. During this time, slaves were divided into two groups: black slaves, called ABD, and white slaves, called Mamluks and Kuls. The fact that slaves were grouped by color also meant that their jobs were different. Most black slaves were put in charge of peasants and household tasks, while Mamluk slaves and Kurds were put in charge of the army and government. Turks were famous as slaves in the military because they were good riders, could shoot arrows, and were loyal to their masters. In addition to being loyal, military slaves help rulers gain more control over an area and weaken the power of local elites who might threaten central power. When this group of slaves based on their skin color was made, they were treated differently. In reality, slaves who were white had more freedom than slaves who were black. If they did well, they could move up in society, while black people didn't have as many chances. So it's not surprising that after the Umayyads, black slaves were rarely found in strategic places around palaces. This system of grouping slaves also led to the rise of several slave kingdoms, including the Mamluks of Egypt. Slaves who had been in the army and in charge of the government ran the family. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about civilization or time period we should talk about. Also watch another video here.
Left, right. Left, right.
Oh, ew.
Left, right.
Aha. Usually when we in the diaspora think about the slave trade, we tend to think about the Atlantic slave trade. But today, I wanted to bring our attention to an event that also disrupted African history, an event that some may even consider much worse. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want access to sources, courses, exclusive videos, or if you simply want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. The Arab slave trade began when the Arabs first invaded North Africa in the 7th century. The Arabs' first entry point into North Africa was, of course, Egypt. The general Amir ibn al-As invaded Egypt in December 639 with a humble force of 4,000 men, according to the often in exchange for firearms. In addition to the many East African slaves sent to the distant shores of Arabia and the Persian Gulf, others remained as laborers on Arab plantations in East Africa, such as the Omani.
Last week I talked about how Islam advocates slavery, which means it approves of slavery and makes regulations to it in its fundamental scriptures. Now I want to go in Islam's history with slavery. That history is very big, to say the least, so I can obviously not cover everything, but I want to make you familiar with how the Islamic world was widely involved in slavery, and was mainly the major party to run it. Let's go back in history and have a look at one of the biggest slave trades. According to historians and even fundamental Islamic scriptures, slavery was quite common in Arabia in Muhammad's time, so that Muhammad, the Prophet himself, had dozens of male and female slaves and actively traded slaves, or captured prisoners of war and generously distributed them as slaves to his warriors, because Muhammad was a very generous man, no offense. Islam didn't end slavery, although it had the power to do so. Instead, Islam adopted slavery and regulated it. When Arabs started conquering their way to Africa, the importing of slaves from Africa increased gradually, and when Muslims conquered significant parts of the eastern coast of Africa, they started actively assimilating slavery as an important part of their economic system. Historians place the beginning of the Arab slave trade to the 7th and 8th centuries, 7 centuries before the Atlantic slave trade, although practically it began much earlier and was, as far as we can see, always there. The slave trade expanded greatly throughout the next 1,000 years and involved not only black African slaves, but also Europeans, especially Southern Europeans, and Indians to some extent. Later it was also not only the Arab slave trade, but a large network of different nations buying and selling slaves. There weren't many Arabs among slaves, but many Arab women were enslaved and usually sold to other Muslim nations in North Africa. Women were in general a big part of the slave trade because Islam has a very popular form of sex slavery. The end of the slave trade was somewhere in the 20th century. The Islamic world was the last to officially abolish slavery. The slave trade lasted around 1,200 to 1,300 years or more. The name Arab slave trade is also disputed. Calling it Arab slave trade seems misleading to some, because parties involved were far more than just Arabs. We could also call it bluntly the Islamic or Muslim slave trade, or more generally the Eastern slave trade. The main victims of the slave trade were black Africans, also called Zanj. Zanj means basically blacks, and was used by Arabs and later by other Muslims to refer to dark-skinned Africans to the south. Arab views on black Africans were, as we can see in history, not very bright. And Muhammad's language, Muhammad himself, makes it even additionally clear. In a hadith, he tells his companions to respect everyone who rules over them, no matter from what group he is, and then goes on and says, even if he was an Ethiopian black slave whose head looks like a raisin. Come on, Muhammad, this is so childish. Another notable record by a Muslim comes from a Tunisian Arab called Ibn Khaldun, whose work Muqaddimah is widely regarded as forerunner of modern historiography and sociology. It might be a forerunner, but it's certainly not sweet. In his book, Ibn Khaldun describes sub-Saharan Africans as natural slaves and says the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because Negroes have little that is human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals. It is important to note that Ibn Khaldun is seen as an important part of what people call the Golden Age of Islam. If you are not disgusted yet, let's go on. As explained in the last episode, Islam doesn't allow the enslavement of Muslims, and therefore the main target of slavery were non-Muslims, and the easiest target were black Africans who were even more underdeveloped than Arabs, which means something. Historical reports show that slavery was an important part of the Islamic hegemony as early as in the Rashidun Caliphate, more notably in the Umayyad Caliphate, and more harshly in the Abbasid Caliphate. The first big international agreement to trade slaves was made during the Rashidun Caliphate under Umar's reign, who was the second caliph and a very respected figure in Islam. When the Rashidun Caliphate conquered Egypt and considered conquering the region to the south, but was defeated in a battle, the Muslims realized that conquering the region would be too difficult for that time, so they persuaded the Christian kingdom of Makuria with an agreement called BOUCK3 instead. According to that agreement, Arabs wouldn't attack Makuria and Makuria wouldn't attack the Muslims, but Makuria had to send 360 high-quality slaves to the new Muslim Egypt every year. This agreement was criticized by some Islamic scholars, not because it's a violation of human dignity, what are you thinking, but because it was an obstacle to the expansion of Islam, since the Muslims had a treaty with Makuria now and couldn't invade it in future. The agreement lasted over 600 years and continued under all the other caliphates that ruled Egypt. It was clearly approved of by the Islamic powers. But the use of slaves was not limited to that region. They were also sent in big numbers to eastern lands, through India, even to Southeast Asia and China. Speaking of India, the Umayyad Caliphate enslaved thousands of Indian people during its campaigns in India, and made big contributions to expanding the demographic diversity and numbers of slaves. Slaves were also under very harsh conditions under the Umayyads, because the Umayyad Caliphate had a hierarchical worldview of Arab supremacy, placing even non-Arab Muslims below Arabs. You can only imagine how non-Muslims and slaves were treated. It was also the Umayyad Caliphate and Islam that brought major slavery to India. Before it was there, but slavery was not big in India. Islam brought it there. The Umayyads also enslaved Europeans and enabled the enslavement of South Europeans under future Muslim rulers in North Africa and Spain, or Iberia. Slaves were captured from Italy, southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, and later even at coastlines of the British Isles, Iceland, and other places. The Umayyads also openly discouraged the conversion of so-called slave nations to Islam, because actively converting them would be an obstacle to enslaving them, and slaves becoming Muslims would give them more rights to free themselves from slavery, which would damage the cause. The Abbasids imported big numbers of slaves as military forces or as cheap labor. We can even see this in a historical rebellion called the Zanj Rebellion, the rebellion of black people, led by an unknown man called Ali ibn Muhammad, who gathered myriads of black slaves. It was one of the largest, most destructive rebellions in the region ever. The historical background and circumstances of the rebellion show us that slaves were in extremely poor and harsh conditions under the Islamic Caliphate, and were very often mistreated by society and their masters. The rebellion was one of many rebellions under the Abbasid Caliphate, but since slaves and blacks were treated poorly, very high numbers of slaves and other black people joined this rebellion. It was eventually crushed by the Abbasid forces and ended with a death toll that is estimated to be between more than 500,000 to 2.5 million. This rebellion didn't end slavery, it only weakened the Abbasid Caliphate temporarily. In the following centuries, slavery was always upheld and a big part of the Abbasid Caliphate's social structure. The Turkish Seljuks and the Ottoman Empire, or Caliphate, also maintained slavery, although Seljuks were formerly slaves themselves. The same was the case under the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. Mamluk means basically slave. The Mamluk rulers were former slaves, but they maintained slavery widely under their own rule, because slavery was a big part of Islamic society. It couldn't just be dismissed. Especially the Ottoman Empire used slavery widely, but in the empire, slaves were rather domestic servants instead of labor force. What the Ottoman Empire also did was to expand the demographics of slavery further. Raiding Europeans and Caucasians and enslaving captured people became a common practice. Barbary pirates under the Ottomans made big raids and captured people from coastlines to bring them back as slaves. Especially children and women that were captured were very valuable, because as noted in history, unlike in the European Atlantic slave trade, in the Islamic slave trade, female slaves were in high demand and children in even higher demands. You have surely heard of famous Ottoman harems. Those harems were full of sex slaves. Sex slavery was very common in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had the biggest harems. Black slaves in the Ottoman Empire served in harems, while white slaves were in administrative positions. Ottomans also captured young Christian boys and raised them with Islamic Ottoman indoctrination and turned them into a feared class of soldiers, the Janissaries. Janissaries were the elite military force of the Ottoman Empire. They were children of Christians, kidnapped by the Ottoman Empire or taken from families that were unable to pay the jizya tax, forcibly raised under Islam, forbidden to create families, and subjected to absolute loyalty to the Ottoman government. Slavery was so big in the Ottoman Empire that 1/5 of the population in 1609 were slaves. But there is more to all the slaves, especially under the Ottomans. You almost thought I wasn't going to mention it, right? Another very was castration. The Ottoman Empire didn't want to put up with sexually active men working for them in their own homes, which is why most slaves were castrated from childhood. But this is not a practice that belonged only to the Ottoman Empire. That practice came into the Ottoman Empire from Islamic rule and Arabs. Even in early Islamic history, imported slaves were mostly castrated, who underwent this barbaric practice in their childhood, so they could serve as eunuchs and wouldn't need sexual goals and trouble. To be fair, this practice was not started by the Muslims, but the Muslim world was the biggest customer of castrated black or white slaves. They were in such high demand that everyone paid more for a castrated slave, which increased the castration of slaves before their import. Therefore, the Islamic world started actively castrating captured slaves as well, since sexual segregation is very important in Islam, and men without penises apparently came handy. It is reported that the Abbasid Caliphate had 7,000 black and 4,000 white castrated slaves only serving the palace in the 10th century. And it is estimated that the majority of slaves in the entire Arab slave trade for over 13 centuries were castrated, meaning they had their testicles and penis completely removed, which was a dangerous practice. It is reported that most slaves died during castration, but castrated slaves were so valuable that the masters of the Islamic world and their suppliers never stopped this practice until the 20th century. Slavery went on wherever Islam arrived. It was part of the economic system in North Africa, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and widely in Asia. And the Islamic world abolished slavery after everyone else, only under heavy pressure of the West. Slavery even boomed once again in the Islamic world when Europe abandoned slavery in the 19th century. And the enslavement of Africans declined only when Europeans colonized and scrambled Africa again in the 19th century. In fact, it is recorded that the Ottoman Empire still sold masses of slaves in the 20th century, before it collapsed. In countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, or Qatar, it was still widely ongoing until half a century ago. In Sudan and Mauritania, it was going on for much longer. In fact, the last country to officially abolish slavery was Mauritania in 1981, only 37 years ago. And unofficially, it is still ongoing in Mauritania. In Sudan, there have been reports of slaves being sold through open auctions in Libya only years ago. And there are experienced reports of slaves from the Gulf countries. Mauritania was even so arbitrary that it criminalized slavery only in 2007, 11 years ago. Another important detail to mention is that the infamous European Atlantic slave trade was inspired by slavery that was already in Asia, and Muslim nations were directly involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It is proven that Muslim nations contributed greatly to the Atlantic slave trade, and so did sub-Saharan African nations. Why wouldn't they? The Europeans came as amateurs, while the Islamic world were already masters of slavery. Yet we are only talking about Europeans and slavery. As we can see, slavery was a very big part of society and economy in the Islamic world throughout history. It was there before the West, and it ended after the West, due to Western pressure. And partially it is still ongoing. It was also more fatal than the Atlantic slave trade, harsher against women and children, and racism was a very, very strong factor in it. So was religious supremacy, Islamic supremacy. It is unbelievable that we are not talking about this today, when the Islamic world should come together, face its past, admit everything, and apologize for the atrocities. After all of this, how can anyone come and say that the Islamic history was peaceful and equal for everyone? After all of this, think about groups like the Nation of Islam that advocated conversion to Islam because the evil white Christian men enslaved them. Movements advocating such ideas were either deceitful or completely ignorant about their history. This was a rather short but comprehensive summary of the history of slavery in the Muslim world. I can't possibly talk about everything, because I would be taking too much of your time. But I would encourage everyone to research this and to work on this history, so that we can let more and more people know about these atrocities committed by a very big religious group that has ironically recently started to describe its religion as peaceful. If you think that a religion that advocates slavery is peaceful, then go ahead and call it so. If you think mainly castrated black men traded on open squares in the capitals of big empires is an example of peace, go ahead and call it so. I will certainly not agree with that, and I will be here to give you more and more reasons why I don't agree with that. Islam is not a religion of peace, and never has been and never will be. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to share. My videos are not monetized, so you can watch everything without any ads. If you want to support me and my cause, you can support me on Patreon. The link is below in the description. You can also choose to support me once through PayPal. Thank you so much for every kind of support. We'll see each other in another video. Have a nice day and stay away from Islam.
Our hearts are broken over the harsh realities that the people of Palestine, and especially Gaza, are facing. Working with partners, Hidayah Foundation has funded over $600,000 worth of food parcels and cooked meals for civilian families under siege in Gaza. We have been funding 2 distribution points, giving out more than 7,000 cooked meals daily. It costs around $1 to $2 per meal. The situation is very dire for millions affected by this siege. Please keep them in your prayers. As the situation permits, Hidayah, in conjunction with our partners, will go on channelizing funds so that it reaches those in need in the most impactful ways, inshallah. Please donate so we may continue helping families in need.
Palestinians are racist to black people. And if you look around, it's black people that are out there advocating for the rights of Palestinians. This should be a lesson for Palestinians and the Arab community in general, to stop being racist towards black people.
Palestinians are Arabs. Saying, have you ever heard about the Arab slave trade? Go and look it up. Go and read up on the Arab slave trade and see how brutal they were to black people. See me? I'm not gonna further. All me I say is, we not take no side with none of them post sold. Make them kill off them bumbucklad self.
So there is a neighborhood in Gaza, on the Gaza Strip, where 11,000 Afro-Palestinians live. It is called Al Abib. You know what that means? Slave. Yes, that is where black people live, and that is what the Arabics call that neighborhood, slaves, the land of the slaves.
To understand what it's like to be black in Palestine, one must grasp, first, the historical backdrop that shapes this narrative. Being black in Palestine is a journey through intersecting histories, cultures, and struggles. It is a narrative that resonates with the echoes of the global black diaspora as individuals find themselves navigating a space where their identity intersects with the challenges of occupation, displacement, and the quest for self-determination in the heart of the Middle East. Historically, Palestine has been a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ethnicities. Against this backdrop, the black experience therein is both unique and shared. The echoes of African heritage in the region, intertwined with the struggles of the Palestinian people, create a dynamic and multifaceted identity. From the Nubian presence in ancient times to the contemporary African diaspora in places like Jericho, the black experience is embedded in the historical fabric of the land. Yet, the complexity of being black in Palestine extends beyond historical roots. Rather, it intertwines with the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where racial dynamics become entangled with political realities. Black Palestinians, much like their counterparts in other parts of the world, face the challenges of systemic discrimination, unequal access to resources, and a struggle for recognition. This, sadly, is what it is. Welcome to yet another poignant video segment. Today, we are taking a dive at what it's like to be black in Palestine. We are also visiting briefly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in relation to the discrimination suffered by peoples of color in Palestine and all over the globe at large. Before we continue, don't forget to support our persistent efforts to fill you in by pressing the like button before you, share with your family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to keep the channel growing. Your support is immensely valued. Now back to the basics. Beginning from recent times, there is pandemonium, the bloodiness oozing across the entire globe as another Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been hatched for quite some time recently, since the month of October, and is now at its outrageous peak. This time, more than 10,000 people have been killed in just 31 days of relentless Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip, according to Palestinian health officials, with no signs of a ceasefire in the besieged enclave. Thousands of Palestinians have left northern Gaza on foot, waving white flags and moving southwards in search of refuge that has become increasingly elusive as Israel pounds the entire enclave with airstrikes. Everywhere is in the strangest, bloodiest disarray.
And yet, as heartbreaking as the news is right now, and it is heartbreaking, as we speak, the world feels more unstable and more dangerous than it has in a very long time. And of course, over the last few weeks, we have watched a deadly struggle unfold in the Middle East, triggered by the horrific murder of more than 1,400 mostly civilian Israelis, many of them children, at the hands of Hamas, as well as the abduction of over 200 hostages. And then an Israeli response that has so far resulted in the displacement of well over 1 million people, the death of at least 9,000 Palestinian civilians, thousands of them also children, the cutoff of water, food, electricity to a captive population that risks creating an even greater humanitarian crisis. It is hard to feel hopeful.
Money makes the world go round. Crypto makes the world go forward.
The images of families mourning, of bodies being pulled from rubble, force a moral reckoning on all of us.
The United Nations said on Wednesday that 15,000 Palestinians had fled northern Gaza the day before, using the main traffic artery, Salah al-Din Road. This was 3 times the figure estimated on Monday. The Israeli military had given residents of northern Gaza a 4-hour window to leave on Wednesday. Thousands of people are seen moving south, not car convoys. They're walking and waving white flags in fear of being attacked. They're moving together in large groups, believing there could still be some safety in numbers, in a desperate journey south to a future they have no idea what it holds. Palestinians say that no corner of the Strip is safe from Israeli bombardment. More than 70% of Gaza's 2.3 million residents have been utterly displaced. The majority, including children, the elderly and people with disabilities, have fled with minimal belongings. Some reported having to cross Israeli checkpoints to reach the southern areas and witnessing arrests by Israeli forces. In a statement on Monday, Gaza's Ministry of Health said the death toll has risen to at least over 10,400 Palestinians and counting, including over 4,300 children. With many victims still trapped beneath the rubble and an Israeli siege drying up access to vital goods like fuel, food, and electricity. And what could have possibly brought about this insane devastation in the cities of Palestine? The war, it was said, broke out on the 7th October when Hamas launched attacks on southern Israel that authorities there said killed more than 1,400 people. Hamas militants had stormed into Israel on a Saturday morning, 7th October 2023, slaying hundreds of residents in homes and streets near the Gaza border and bringing gun battles to Israeli towns for the first time in decades. Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza made away with about 150 soldiers and civilians whom they're currently holding hostage, according to Israel. Israel had stepped up its offensive on a Tuesday, October 10th, 2023, expanding the mobilization of reservists to 360,000. Israel's military said it had regained effective control over areas Hamas attacked in its south and of the Gaza border. The displacement in Gaza, where the majority of the population are refugees with parents or grandparents who were forcibly expelled from their homes and barred from returning during the founding of Israel in 1948, have reignited a painful sense of déjà vu. We cannot find food, and there is no flour. People are waiting in long queues for water. Moamen al-Arja, a mother sheltering in southern Gaza, told Al Jazeera. In a split second, Gaza has been turned into a black box. The only light in the Gaza Strip at night will be from fires started by Israeli bombs and a handful of hospitals powered by sputtering generators. The territory's last functioning power plant ran out of fuel on Wednesday, 2 days after the Israeli defense minister announced that there would be a complete blockade during the siege. No water, no food, no electricity, and almost no information either. Israel's war on Hamas for killing more than 1,200 people this weekend has effectively turned the home of 2.3 million people into a deadly prison. Dwindling electricity and the destruction of civilian infrastructure have left very few ways for Palestinians in Gaza to communicate with one another or the world outside. Notwithstanding, it would seem that the playout of this horrible event is beginning to wake the world a bit on some major unfinished business, thus have been the major contributory factor to the recent momentum for global dialogue on reparatory justice for the people of African descent, held by the Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Committee, SOCHUM, also known as the Third Committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations, on the 30th of October, 2023, as numerous delegates in the meeting also voiced support for the right of Palestinians to self-determination. Barbara G. Reynolds, chair of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, highlighted an analysis of how post-colonial structures, systems, and practices continue to mimic the intent laid down during enslavement and colonization across the intersections of civil, political, economic, and cultural spheres, subjecting people of African descent to a third wave of economic deprivation and hardship. These structures, which are in banking, finance, insurance, taxation, land rights, and land use, continue to constrain wealth creation and, most importantly, intergenerational wealth creation. Reynolds recognized that black debt, or systems and policies that have effectively promoted precarity and drained assets from individuals and communities of African descent via financial instruments, is a burden at national, community, and individual levels. Accordingly, she urged all member states to put in place mechanisms to eliminate structural and systemic bias and discrimination against people of African descent. Adding to that, Epsie Campbell-Barr, chair of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, highlighted the continued excessive use of force by law enforcement against people of African descent, persistent violence against migrants and asylum seekers of African descent, and backsliding in the area of equal education. Against this backdrop, she underlined the importance of drafting a United Nations declaration on the promotion, protection, and full respect for the human rights of people of African descent. Representatives from all over the globe were present in this meeting, owing to the height of the emergence of the situation on ground. The committee's interactive dialogue centered on the theme racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance were critically discussed. Numerous delegates expressed solidarity with Palestinians, noting that all peoples, including those under foreign occupation, have the right to self-determination. Among them was the representative of Bangladesh, who condemned in the strongest possible terms the occupation by Israel as well as its genocidal policies and actions in Palestine. Israel's current military operation in Gaza has crossed all boundaries of international norms and principles, he said, adding that over 7,000 civilians and counting have been killed so far, half of them children, as at the time of this meeting. Voicing regret over the inability of the Security Council to stop Israel's atrocities, he called for an immediate humanitarian truce and welcomed the announcement of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to prioritize investigation in the situation of Palestine. Adding to that, Jordan's delegate said that over the past 3 weeks, 59 staff of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, have been killed in Gaza. Further, indiscriminate shelling and the collective deprivation of food, water, and fuel heighten exposure of the most vulnerable in Gaza to racial discrimination and xenophobic violence, she warned. Expressing dismay over the situation in Gaza and the speedily climbing mortality was also the representative of Indonesia, who said they represent dreams shattered, families broken, and futures stolen. The peace process must be restarted to avoid a situation where there is nothing left to negotiate with or, tragically, no one left to negotiate with, she said. For Palestinians under Israeli occupation, the right to self-determination only exists in theory, said the representative of the League of Arab States, citing Israel's attempts to expel the people south before their displacement to neighboring countries.
Now then, the racial climate that existed at the time, let's take a look at the U.S. presidents who owned slaves in various capacities. George Washington. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was a central figure in American history. Born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, he famously appeared on the $1 bill, revered as one of the men that made the United States what it today. George Washington is well known on his leadership in the founding of the United States, his role in shaping the nation's early institutions, and his dedication to the cause of American independence. He is celebrated for his leadership during the Revolutionary War, his presidency, and his pivotal role in the drafting of the United States Constitution. Washington's commitment to a unified nation and his willingness to step down from power after 2 terms set important precedents for American democracy. However, what most people don't know is that the same man that fought for American freedom from the tyranny of the British was a slave owner, like many other prominent figures of his time. At the time of his death in 1799, he owned over 300 enslaved individuals. When George Washington was 11 years old, his father died, and Washington inherited a small estate and 10 enslaved people. He continued to increase the number of enslaved people under his control throughout his life. Washington's estate, Mount Vernon, housed hundreds of enslaved people, some of whom Washington had purchased through the slave trade, and others who had been born into enslavement under Washington's control. After Washington married Martha Custis, she brought more than 80 enslaved people with her to Mount Vernon. Most of Washington's slaves labored in Mount Vernon's fields, while others worked near or within the Washington home. Like many Virginia plantation owners, Washington used overseers to supervise labor and to mete out verbal admonitions and physical beatings when he deemed them necessary. Washington often made the final decision about these whippings and was also known to personally use harsh language towards slaves he believed were not doing their work. As president, Washington made two major policy decisions that signaled support for the institution of slavery. First, he oversaw an unsuccessful program of support for the French government as it contended with a massive slave rebellion in the colony of Saint-Domingue, which eventually became the Haitian Revolution. Second, and most notably, he signed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, which provided a mechanism for enslavers to invoke the right, from the U.S. Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, to pursue and reclaim people who had fled enslavement to states with less slavery. And despite his reservations about the slave trade in 1774, Washington brushed off a 1791 entreaty from the Quaker community demanding an end to the slave trade. Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidential election of 1800, he had been an enslaver for almost 50 years. Like Washington, Jefferson had inherited slaves as a child after his father's death in 1757, and he later inherited more than 100 slaves after his father-in-law died in 1773. Jefferson's slaves were held captive at his main residence, Monticello, near Charlottesville, Virginia, as well as other locations in the state. Jefferson closely controlled the management of slave labor at Monticello. He generally did not believe in separating families of enslaved people because keeping them together would lead to reproduction and natural population growth, obviating the need to buy new slaves through the slave trade. Violence against enslaved people was common at Monticello, although Jefferson likely did not personally whip or otherwise physically torture them. According to historian Annette Gordon Reed, Thomas Jefferson's sexual interactions with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, likely led to her giving birth to 6 or 7 children. Gordon Reed points to the preferential treatment of the Hemings children as circumstantial evidence that Jefferson more closely regarded them than any other enslaved people at Monticello. Several were spared onerous labor as children, and all were eventually freed. Moreover, Gordon Reed has traced how since Jefferson's death, historians and others invested in preserving Jefferson's reputation had purposefully obscured the Hemings connection. DNA testing in the late 1990s suggested strongly that he could not be ruled out as the father, and most scholarly historians now view it as likely that he was. As president and in his private life and writings, Jefferson developed a contradictory record on slavery. He directed the Louisiana Purchase, which eventually led to the massive growth of plantation slavery in the Gulf South and beyond. Yet he also permitted American merchants to trade with Haitian revolutionaries against French enslavers and the French government, and in 1808, he signed a law that criminalized participation in the international slave trade. In his autobiography, Jefferson suggested that slavery would eventually end and that black enslaved people would be freed. Yet, in his earlier and popular work, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson wrote that black people were inferior to whites.
Perhaps most damning was Jefferson's lack of care for the enslaved people at Monticello after his death, as more than 100 were sold to help cover Jefferson's debts, leading to the traumatic separation of families and their removal from Monticello. James Madison. James Madison, who succeeded Thomas Jefferson as president in 1809, came from a large slaveholding family in Orange County, Virginia. When Madison went to Princeton University in 1769, he brought an enslaved person named Sawney with him, and Sawney would later go on to become a trusted overseer of the Madison family estate, Montpelier. In his lifetime, Madison emancipated only one enslaved person, Billy. Billy went to Philadelphia with Madison and lived with him during the time of the Continental Congress. Madison believed that Billy had learned too much about what it meant to be free to return to life as a slave. Billy, Madison seemed to fear, might teach other enslaved people about the freedom he had experienced in the North and endanger the institution of slavery at Montpelier. The rest of the people Madison owned as slaves, he bequeathed to his wife. Madison's political thought, which is widely considered pivotal to the creation of the United States, featured ambivalence about the morality and importance of slavery. On one hand, especially during the height of the American Revolution, Madison questioned whether
Need power? Try the #1 longest-lasting AA battery, Energizer Ultimate Lithium.
whether slavery should be a fundamental part of the American experience. At the Constitutional Convention, he criticized the slave trade and quipped that it would be wrong to codify in the Constitution the principle that human beings could be held as property. But Madison's brief dalliance with anti-slavery thought receded by the time he was Secretary of State during the Jefferson administration. When Madison became president, he imported to the White House several enslaved people from Montpelier. Scholars have identified that President Madison, and especially First Lady Dolly Madison, turned the White House into a key venue for political activity, and slave labor proved to be pivotal to these efforts. Madison's post-presidential life exemplified his contradictory philosophical and personal dealings with slavery. During the Virginia Constitutional Convention in 1829, Madison insisted that both free and enslaved African Americans should be counted for purposes of representation in the state legislature. However, as historian Paris Amanda Spies-Gans explains, Madison abandoned his principles when he sold enslaved people to cope with mounting financial woes at Montpelier. 15 years after leaving the White House, James Madison became president of the American Colonization Society, which was founded in 1816 and advocated for the deportation of the free black population in the United States to colonies in Africa. James Monroe. James Monroe was born to a prosperous family in Virginia. After the death of his parents, Monroe and his siblings shared an inheritance of land and enslaved people. In 1799, James Monroe and his family moved to Highland, a plantation worked by enslaved people outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. After fighting in the American Revolution and becoming a mentee of Thomas Jefferson, Monroe became involved in politics. During his time as governor of Virginia, Monroe dealt with Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, when he called out the local military guard to thwart a planned slave uprising in Richmond, Virginia. This event led Monroe to support colonization out of a desire to protect the white population of Virginia from possible slave rebellions. By deporting the free black community, Monroe believed slavery in Virginia would be less susceptible to the kind of unrest that had occurred during Gabriel's Rebellion. From a policy perspective, Monroe's term as president is important because he signed the law that would come to be known as the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a state where slavery was legal. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, had a large number of enslaved people who worked in the cotton fields of his plantation, the Hermitage, nearby Nashville, Tennessee. Jackson participated in the slave trade in order to grow his slave labor force to more than 150 people by the time he died in 1845. As master, Jackson's concern for the preservation of his wealth and property meant that he demanded that overseers and others responsible for the daily management of operations at the Hermitage avoid excessive violence toward the enslaved population. On the other hand, Jackson demanded vicious retribution against enslaved people when he wanted it. Infamously, he once wrote an advertisement for the capture of a slave named Tom Gid, who had run away from the Hermitage, that offered $10 extra for every 100 lashes the captor laid on the captive. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was an American military officer and politician who served as the 9th President of the United States. Harrison died just 31 days after his inauguration as president in 1841, making his presidency the shortest in U.S. history. He was also the first U.S. president to die in office, causing a brief constitutional crisis since presidential succession was not then fully defined in the United States Constitution. Harrison inherited several slaves, and as the first governor of the Indiana Territory, he unsuccessfully lobbied Congress to legalize slavery in Indiana. In addition to resulting tensions with the Indians, Harrison's pro-slavery position made him unpopular with the Indiana Territory's abolitionists, as he tried in vain to encourage slavery in the territory. In 1803, he had lobbied Congress to temporarily suspend for 10 years Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance prohibiting slavery in the Indiana Territory. Though Harrison asserted that the suspension was necessary to promote settlement and make the territory economically viable and ready for statehood, the proposal failed. Lacking the suspension of Article 6 in 1807, the territorial legislature, with Harrison's support, enacted laws that authorized indentured servitude and gave masters authority to determine the length of service. Dilcia allegedly was a woman enslaved by future President William Henry Harrison. According to civil rights activist Walter Francis White's family oral history, Harrison purportedly had 6 children with Dilcia. Walter Francis White's oral history asserts when Harrison decided to run for president, he concluded that it would not be politically advantageous for him to have bastard slave children in his home. Accordingly, Harrison allegedly gave 4 of Dilcia's children to his brother. His brother, in turn, is claimed to have sold the children to Joseph Poythress, one of the earliest white settlers of LaGrange, Georgia. John Tyler. John Tyler was the 10th President of the United States, serving from 1841 to 1845, after briefly holding office as the 10th Vice President in 1841. He was elected Vice President on the 1840 Whig ticket with President William Henry Harrison, succeeding to the presidency following Harrison's death 31 days after assuming office. U.S. President John Tyler owned as many as 50 slaves during his lifetime. According to a news item from 1943 on slave-owning presidents, it is said that John Tyler sold one of his slaves to defray his expenses when he went to Washington to assume his duties as Vice President of the United States. The names of 3 people enslaved by Tyler are currently known to researchers through the historical record: Armistead, James Hambleton Christian, and Aunt Fanny. In the 1840s, abolitionist publisher Joshua Leavitt alleged that Tyler fathered multiple enslaved children. James Knox Polk. James Knox Polk was the 11th President of the United States, serving from 1845 to 1849. Polk is known for extending the territory of the United States through the Mexican-American War during his presidency, annexing the Republic of Texas, the Oregon Territory, and the Mexican Cession after winning the Mexican-American War. Polk became the Democratic nominee for president in 1844, partially because of his tolerance of slavery, in contrast to Van Buren. As president, he generally supported the rights of slave owners. His will provided for the freeing of his slaves after the death of his wife, though the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution ended up freeing them long before her death in 1891. In his inaugural address, delivered in a steady rein, Polk made clear his support for slavery. Although he did not mention slavery specifically, he alluded to it, decrying those who would tear down an institution protected by the Constitution. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, who became the 17th U.S. president following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, was one of the last U.S. presidents to personally own slaves. Andrew Johnson typically said he owned between 8 and 10 slaves, although the exact number is surprisingly difficult to determine. According to Reconstruction historian Manisha Sinha, Johnson is remembered today for making white supremacy the overriding principle of his presidency through his obdurate opposition to Reconstruction, the project to establish an interracial democracy in the United States after the destruction of slavery. He wanted to prevent, as he put it, the Africanization of the country. Under the guise of strict constructionism, states' rights and opposition to big government, previously deployed by Southern slaveholders to defend slavery, Johnson vetoed all federal laws intended to protect former slaves from racial terror and from the black codes passed in the old Confederate states. This reduced African Americans to a state of semi-servitude. Johnson peddled the racist myth that Southern whites were victimized by black emancipation and citizenship, which became an article of faith among Lost Cause proponents in the post-war South. Ulysses S. Grant. The last president to personally own enslaved people was Ulysses S. Grant, who served 2 terms between 1869 and 1877. The former commanding general of the Union Army had kept a lone black enslaved man named William Jones in the years before the Civil War, but gave him his freedom in 1859. Grant would later sum up his evolving views on slavery in 1878, when he was quoted as saying that it was a stain to the Union that people had once been bought and sold like cattle. This brings us to the end of this video. Tell us what you think in the comment section, as we are always interested in your thoughts. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.
While the transatlantic slave trade is often the first thing that comes to mind when we think of slavery, it's important to know that the Arab slave trade was very much in existence and was also quite brutal and cruel. Many slaves died on a long and difficult journey across the Sahara, and those who survived often faced horrific conditions upon reaching their destination. From the brutal capture of women to work in harems, to the unjust castration of male slaves as eunuchs, we'll be exposing the forgotten Arab slave trade of black people. So join us as we uncover this often overlooked and dark chapter of history that they hardly teach in schools. The transatlantic slave trade immense popularity tends to overshadow the Arab slave trade when discussing the history of slavery. However, it will interest you to know that Arab slave traders were among the earliest to enslave Africans, centuries before the transatlantic. The Arab slave trade, or trans-Saharan slave trade, has a much longer history than many realize. Starting as early as the 7th century, Arab traders were already used from Africa to various parts of the world, including the Middle East. While the Arab slave trade boasts a lengthy history, it never attained the immense scale of the transatlantic slave trade. Despite the passage of time and political changes, it did not become illegal or cease with the colonization of Africa. In 1962, Saudi Arabia banned slavery, and by 1969, most Muslim nations had followed suit. However, slavery persisted in Iraq's desert regions and continued in other Arab countries including Yemen and Oman. The term Arab is often used as a racial classification, but is actually more accurately understood as a cultural or ethnic classification. In the past, the likes of Tipu Tip and other Arab slavers often looked no different from the Africans they enslaved. This meant that people from a wide range of racial backgrounds could be considered Arabs, including Caucasian, Asian, and African people. During a period of over 1,000 years from around 650 AD to the 19th century, an estimated 10 to 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab traders and transported across the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Sahara Desert. The enslaved Africans transported by Arab slavers were packed in overcrowded slave ships. They suffered from thirst, hunger, and illness, and were also at the mercy of the cruel treatment meted out by the Arabian slavers. The journey often lasted for several months, with many Africans dying along the way. The trek across the Sahara Desert to the coast was incredibly challenging and dangerous. Enslaved hours of walking in leg and neck chains, battling the relentless desert sun and ever-shifting sands. Many died from exhaustion, and those unable to continue were ruthlessly killed by slave merchants. Not only were enslaved Africans matched to Arabia through the Sahara, but some were also sold to Europeans along the way. In his letters, John Livingstone, a British missionary and explorer, described the brutal treatment of enslaved Africans by their Arab captors, stating how they were forced to travel through the Sahara Desert. Livingstone described how each slave was forced to wear a large forked stick, weighed between 30 and 40 pounds, and extending up to 5 or 6 feet long. He also described how the enslaved women were tied together with bark thongs, which were both cruel and uncomfortable. Zanzibar in Tanzania, which is now famous for its stunning white sand beaches and tourist appeal, once played a central role in the Arab slave trade, which were for sale, including precious raw materials like ivory and clothes. Nonetheless, it was the sight of hundreds of enslaved people that truly stood out above everything else. Merchants from all over the region would bring their slaves to the market in Zanzibar, knowing that they could find buyers there. David Livingstone stated in his letter in 1870 that as many as 50,000 slaves were sold by Arab slavers in the Zanzibar market every year. While some slavers were taken to Egypt or Saudi Arabia, many others were kept in Zanzibar itself, where Omani settlers had begun cultivating cloves in the early 18th century. This was to meet the high demand for cloves on the international market, leading to the rapid growth of large plantations which relied heavily on slave labor. During the Arab slave trade, it's important to highlight that Arab slavers generally avoided converting enslaved Africans to Islam. This decision was strategic, as converting them would grant more rights to the enslaved and reduce the pool of potential slaves. Islamic missionaries adopted a cautious approach when it came to spreading their religion among Africans, mainly because doing so could potentially undermine the slave trade. In Islam, it was strictly forbidden to enslave fellow Muslims, regardless of their racial or ethnic background. This meant that any African who converted to Islam could claim the same religious rights and freedoms as other Muslims, which could reduce their eligibility as slaves. However, unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily sought men for plantation labor, the Arab slave trade had a distinct focus on capturing and selling women and young girls. European slavers generally paid higher prices for male slaves, whereas Arab slavers valued female slaves significantly more than their male counterparts. The ratio of women to men enslaved by the Arabs was a ratio of 3 to 1. This difference was largely due to the fact that the Arab slave trade was primarily driven by the demand for concubines and sex servants rather than manual labor. Another reason was that enslaved girls were viewed as a reflection of one's wealth and symbols of power for the Arabs of that time. Arab slaveholders also had the right to have sexual relations with their female slaves. This resulted in the creation of harems filled with women of African descent who bore many children for their masters. In contrast to European slave traders who commonly classified children born by female slaves to their masters as slaves, under the Islamic legal tradition, these children were recognized as free individuals. This distinction was firmly based on the belief that the child's Islamic heritage, inherited from their father, took precedence over their mother's enslaved status. Such female slaves who bore a child for their master would typically gain their freedom automatically after his passing. While the number of female slaves exported from the Savannah and Horn regions each year was lower than that of the Atlantic slave trade, the proportional impact on the remaining populations in these areas was much greater. This was because the Arabs exported more female slaves than male slaves, so the remaining African population was densely populated by men with fewer women to reproduce. This in return put pressure on the female population, who remained to bear more children in order to replenish the population lost to the slave trade. The population of Africa was estimated to be around 50 million in 1600. However, by 1800, this has fallen to 20%, and by 1900, following the end of the slave trade in Britain and America, it had dropped even further to just over 10%. The loss of a significant portion of the population due to the slave trade negatively impacting Africa's agricultural productivity and economic growth. However, it's a crucial fact that despite the high number of enslaved women taken to the Middle East and Asia, there are no large communities of people of African descent in these regions today. This raises the question of what happened to the descendants of these enslaved women. The lack of large communities of African descent in the Middle East or Asia suggests that the offspring of enslaved women and their Arab masters were often born white, just like their fathers. Another reason was that African male slaves were also castrated by their masters. This prevented them from having children or creating it. The practice of castration was not only used to prevent the birth of children, but also to create eunuchs who could guard the harems. Boys as young as 8 years old and men were forcefully castrated in an attempt to prevent them from having children later in life. This brutal procedure had a high mortality rate, with 6 out of every 10 boys bleeding to death. Some of those who survived died by suicide out of the shame and humiliation of losing their manhood. The high prices for eunuchs on the market made the practice of castration a lucrative one for slave owners. Aside from guarding harems, male slaves were also castrated to serve as eunuchs in domestic service or on plantations. It's also crucial to note that even when Europe and the United States abolished the practice of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, some Arab countries did not do so until much later, and some persisted even into the 20th century. Sadly, in some African countries, hundreds of thousands of people continue to endure modern-day slavery in the 21st century. Many of these victims are young Africans seeking better opportunities who end up enslaved in Arab countries. They are subjected to forced labor, dehumanizing work conditions, and even sexual exploitation against their will. The continued prevalence of modern-day slavery in many parts of the world shows how slavery has been deeply ingrained in our society. However, there is hope that through public awareness like this and media campaigns, the practice will be totally eliminated for good.
Picture a time when the world was a battleground, a struggle for power and wealth tearing through continents like a wild storm. The British Empire, a colossal force in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was at the heart of it all. As Europe clamored for colonies and resources, Africa, with its untapped treasures, became a prized battleground. The British, driven by an insatiable appetite for power and wealth, embarked on a perilous journey that would leave countless lives shattered and traditions in ruins. The pursuit of imperial dominance came at a harrowing cost. The British Empire's unrelenting thirst for African territories ignited wars, some forgotten by history, but forever etched in the memories of those who endured them. From the plains of southern Africa to the heart of East Africa, battles raged on, leaving in their wake a trail of death and destruction. As we unearth these stories, we must confront the grim reality. Countless lives were lost in the name of imperial expansion, but the crimes of the British Empire extended far beyond the battlefield. With the insidious spread of colonialism came the erosion of indigenous cultures and traditions. Rich heritages that had thrived for generations were systematically dismantled, replaced by a foreign order that sought to suppress the very essence of African identity. The scars of cultural loss, though often overlooked, remain as poignant reminders of colonial cruelty. This video is a call to uncover the hidden truths, to shine a light on the darkest corners of history. We will reveal the extent to which the British Empire went to maintain its grip on power, the lies, the betrayals, and the deliberate exploitation of Africa's resources and people. Also, as a way of supporting our efforts, hit the like button of the video, share and subscribe to help the channel grow. Your support means a lot to us. To truly understand the scramble of Africa and the British Empire's role in it, we must first step back in time to the late 19th century. The era was characterized by intense rivalries among European powers, each vying for supremacy on the global stage. As industrialization surged, so did the demand for raw materials, markets, and prestige. Africa, with its vast, untapped resources and uncharted territories, became the ultimate prize. By the 1880s, several European nations had already established footholds along Africa's coasts. Portugal, France, and Belgium were among the early colonizers. However, it was the British Empire, with its vast naval power, that would become the driving force behind the scramble. The strategic location of the British Isles, their established maritime supremacy, and a burgeoning industrial economy set the stage for a remarkable expansion. Around 1884 to 1885, European powers convened in Berlin to divide Africa among themselves. Remarkably, no African leaders were invited to this infamous conference. The British, led by Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, used their diplomatic finesse to secure significant territories. The conference set the stage for the imperial land grab, but it also established certain ground rules for colonialism in Africa. With a head start in terms of existing colonies and naval power, the British Empire swiftly moved to expand its African holdings. Their approach was characterized by a mix of diplomacy, military force, and economic exploitation. Cecil Rhodes, an ambitious British businessman and politician, played a pivotal role in British expansion across Africa. His dream was to create a continuous, British-controlled railway from Cape Town to Cairo, uniting the continent under the Union Jack. Rhodes's British South Africa Company, often accused of brutal practices, gained control over vast territories in southern Africa, including modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. The East African coastline was of significant interest to the British Empire. It provided access to the Indian Ocean and valuable trade routes to India. By the end of the 19th century, British East Africa, which is Kenya and Uganda, became integral parts of the British Empire. The construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway further solidified British control in the region. In a strategic bid to protect their interests in Egypt, the British extended their reach into Sudan. The famous Battle of Omdurman in 1898 marked a decisive victory, solidifying British control over this vital region. Control of the Nile Valley was essential for maintaining the lifeline to India. However, it is one thing to claim a territory for yourself, and it is another to keep that territory when the natives won't back down. While the British Empire was expanding its dominion across Africa, it was not without challenges and resistance. Indigenous peoples and local rulers often resisted European colonization, leading to conflicts that would leave deep scars. This is when the British would decide to exercise the full extent of its power, leading to war crimes that left millions dead in its wake. The destruction of tribes, traditions, and cities, and the brutal enslavement of indigenous people in Africa are just a tip of the colonial crimes perpetrated by the British in the Africa countries that it forcefully colonized. The Mau Mau Rebellion. The British colonial crimes during the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya stand as proof to the depths to which colonial powers were willing to descend in order to maintain their dominion and exploit both the people and the resources of their colonies. It is a story of mass detentions, forced labor, torture, and the suppression of a grassroots movement for independence. The term Mau Mau was originally used by the British to refer to the Kikuyu Central Association, or KCA, a nationalist organization that played a role in the rebellion. Over time, it became associated with the broader anti-colonial movement. The Mau Mau Rebellion emerged as a response to British colonial rule in Kenya, which began in the late 19th century. The Mau Mau movement primarily consisted of Kikuyu people, Kenya's largest ethnic group, who felt marginalized and oppressed by British colonial rule. Kenyan nationalists sought to end colonialism and gain independence. The British colonial authorities had implemented policies that dispossessed Africans of their ancestral lands, pushing them into overcrowded reserves. Many Kenyan farmers lost their livelihoods and faced extreme poverty as European settlers took over their lands. The British also failed to acknowledge the soldiers that fought and died for them in World War II. Many Kenyan men served in the war, and upon returning home, they were met with disappointment and a lack of support from the British colonial administration. The stark contrast between the freedoms they fought for abroad and the oppression they experienced at home contributed to their dissatisfaction. The KCA played a significant role in channeling Kikuyu grievances. It advocated for land rights and political representation, but the British banned it in 1950, further radicalizing many Kikuyu members. Leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, who would later become Kenya's first president, advocated for peaceful resistance and negotiations with the British. However, a more militant faction within the Kikuyu community emerged, believing that armed struggle was the only way to achieve their goals. The Mau Mau movement became distinct with the taking of an oath that bound its members in secrecy and loyalty to the cause. The Mau Mau Rebellion officially began in 1952 with attacks on European settlers, Kikuyu loyalists to the colonial government and infrastructure. The British and international view was that Mau Mau was a savage, violent, and depraved tribal cult, an expression of unrestrained emotion rather than reason. According to them, Mau Mau was perverted tribalism that sought to take the Kikuyu people back to the bad old days before British rule. The official British explanation of the revolt did not include the insights of agrarian and agricultural experts, of economists and historians, or even of Europeans who had spent a long period living amongst the Kikuyu and relied on the purported insights of the ethno-psychiatrist. With Mau Mau, it fell to Dr. John Colin Carruthers to perform the desired analysis. This ethno-psychiatric analysis guided British psychological warfare, which painted Mau Mau as an irrational force of evil, dominated by bestial impulses and influenced by world communism, and the later official study of the uprising, the Corfield Report. The psychological war became of critical importance to military and civilian leaders who tried to emphasize that there was in effect a civil war, and that the struggle was not black versus white, attempting to isolate Mau Mau from the Kikuyu and the Kikuyu from the rest of the colony's population and the world outside. In driving a wedge between Mau Mau and the Kikuyu generally, these propaganda efforts essentially played no role, though they could apparently claim an important contribution to the isolation of Mau Mau from the non-Kikuyu sections of the population. The British response to the Mau Mau Rebellion indeed involved the use of harsh and, in many cases, brutal methods to suppress the uprising. The British colonial authorities were determined to quell the rebellion and protect their interests in Kenya. These measures included mass arrests, forced resettlement, torture, and other forms of coercion. One of the most notorious aspects of the British response was the establishment of detention camps, where thousands of suspected Mau Mau sympathizers and rebels were held. Between 160,000 and 320,000 were interned in detention camps, also known as concentration camps. Most of the rest, more than 1 million Kikuyu, were held in enclosed villages as part of the villagization program. Although some were Mau Mau guerrillas, most were victims of collective punishment that colonial authorities imposed on large areas of the country. Thousands were beaten or sexually assaulted to extract information about the Mau Mau threat. Later, prisoners suffered even worse mistreatment in an attempt to force them to renounce their allegiance to the insurgency and to obey commands. Prisoners were questioned with the help of slicing off ears, boring holes in eardrums, flogging until death, pouring paraffin over suspects who were then set alight, and burning eardrums with lit cigarettes. The use of castration and denying access to medical aid to the detainees by the British were also widespread and common. Among the detainees who suffered severe mistreatment was Hussein Onyango Obama, the grandfather of former U.S. President Barack Obama, the first black man to lead the United States. According to his widow, British soldiers forced pins into his fingernails and buttocks and squeezed his private parts between metal rods. The Hola Camp massacre in 1959 also stands out as a particularly grim example. Hola Camp was established to house detainees classified as hardcore. By January 1959, the camp had a population of 506 detainees, of whom 127 were held in a secluded closed camp. This more remote camp was reserved for the most uncooperative of the detainees. They often refused, even when threats of force were made, to join in the colonial rehabilitation process, or perform manual labor, or obey colonial orders. The camp commandant outlined a plan that would force 88 of the detainees to bend to work. On the 3rd of March 1959, the camp commandant put this plan into action, as a result of which 11 of the detainees were clubbed to death by guards. All the 77 surviving detainees sustained serious permanent injuries. In an effort to hide the brutality of their death, the British would cover up the case. After the Hola massacre, the name of Hola was changed to Galol by the colonial government in order to ensure their atrocities never saw the light of day. However, fate had something else in store. The first report to surface about the incident was in the East African Standard. The front page article reported that 10 died at the Hola detention camp. The paper quoted the official statement from the colonial authorities. The men were in a group of about 100 who were working on digging furrows. The deaths occurred after they had drunk water from a water cart, which was used by all members of the working party and the guards. More information about the incident emerged in the weeks that followed the initial reports. An investigation into the deaths ensued, and it was discovered that the 11 detainees did not die of drinking foul water, but as a result of violence. The medical examiner said they had died from either lung congestion or shock and hemorrhage following multiple bruises and other injuries. The coroner reported the injuries of a number of Mau Maus apparently were consistent with their allegations that uncooperative prisoners had been beaten by guards, apparently with the consent of the commandant. A report in the June 1959 edition of Time magazine entitled "The Hola Scandal" described the events. The report stated that on the 3rd of March 1959, 85 prisoners were marched outside and ordered to work, but dozens of the prisoners fell to the ground, refusing to work, and were beaten by the guards. When the assault had concluded, according to the magazine, 11 prisoners lay dying, and another 23 needed hospital treatment. Once the inquiry findings were made public, the opposition members in the House of Commons called for a debate. Increasing adverse publicity and calls for further investigations of human rights abuses in the camps led to a reduction in UK governmental support for the Kenya Colonies administration and resulted in accelerated moves towards Kenyan independence. From 1954 to 1960, the British detained approximately 8,000 women under the emergency powers imposed to combat the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. The majority of female detainees were held in Kamiti detention camp, and its importance has been widely acknowledged by historians. However, new documentary evidence released from the Hanslope Park archive since 2011 has revealed the existence of a second camp established for women at Gidamayu, created in 1958 in order to deal with the remaining hardcore female detainees. Furthermore, as the Mau Mau rebellion intensified, the British implemented a scorched earth policy in some areas, where villages suspected of supporting the Mau Mau were burned down, livestock confiscated, and inhabitants forcibly relocated. The goal was to deny the rebels local support and resources. By 1960, according to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, the British had killed, maimed, or tortured 90,000 Kenyans and detained 160,000 in camps. Ultimately, the Mau Mau uprising ended with the capture and imprisonment of many of its leaders and the defeat of the armed insurgency. However, it played a pivotal role in Kenya's path to independence. The negative publicity from British colonial crimes, the Hola massacre, and other forms of violence put pressure on the British Parliament to take action to salvage Britain's deteriorating image. Colonial detention camps were closed throughout Kenya, and the prisoners were freed soon after. Attempts were then made to find a solution to maintaining British interests in Africa without the use of force, indirectly leading to a hastening of independence across British colonies in Africa. In 1963, Kenya gained independence from British colonial rule, with Jomo Kenyatta, a former detainee during the uprising, becoming the country's first prime minister and later its president. With independence achieved, the British would leave Kenya. However, many records related to the Mau Mau Rebellion were kept secret or destroyed by British authorities. This has led to accusations of a deliberate cover-up to protect the reputation of the colonial administration. It wasn't until later, after Kenya had gained its independence, that some of these records were declassified and made available to the public. These documents shed light on the extent of the brutality and abuses committed during the Mau Mau uprising, showing how far the British was willing to go to keep Kenya under its grasp and continue to claim its resources for itself. The British government, after being continually defeated in the High Court, agreed to settle the Mau Mau case in 2013. On June 6 that year, then UK Foreign Secretary William Hague announced 5,000 survivors would each receive £3,800 payment, and he also expressed the nation's sincere regrets to Kenyans, who were subjected to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. The Boer War. More than a century ago, 48,000 people died in concentration camps in what's known as the South African War between 1899 and 1902, or the Boer War. The Second Boer War, also known as the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War, was a conflict fought between the British Empire and the two Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, over the empire's influence in southern Africa from 1899 to 1902. Following the discovery of gold deposits in the Boer republics, there was a large influx of foreigners from the Cape Colony. They were not permitted to have a vote and were regarded as unwelcome visitors, invaders, and they protested to the British authorities in the Cape. In 1899, war erupted between Britain and white Dutch settlers, the Boers, in South Africa, as Britain looked to extend their influence into the Boer-controlled Transvaal and Orange Free State. Negotiations failed, and in the opening stages of the war, the Boers launched successful attacks against British outposts before being pushed back by imperial reinforcements. Though the British swiftly occupied the Boer republics, numerous Boers refused to accept defeat and engaged in guerrilla warfare. In response, the British adopted a scorched earth policy, where they would burn and destroy Boer settlements to deprive them of homes and food supplies. British High Command ordered several scorched earth policies to be implemented as part of a large-scale and multi-pronged counter-insurgency campaign. A complex network of nets, blockhouses, strongpoints, and barbed wire fences was constructed, virtually partitioning the occupied republics. British troops committed several war crimes and were ordered to destroy farms and slaughter livestock to deny them to Boer guerrillas. As Boer farms were destroyed by the British under their scorched earth policy, including the systematic destruction of crops and slaughtering of livestock, the burning down of homesteads and farms, to prevent the Boers from resupplying from a home base, many tens of thousands of women and children were forcibly moved into the concentration camps. This was not the first appearance of internment camps, as the Spanish had used internment in Cuba in the 10 Years' War, but the Boer War concentration camp system was the first time that a whole nation had been systematically targeted, and the first in which whole regions had been depopulated. Eventually, there were a total of 45 tented camps built for Boer internees and 64 for black Africans. The camps were poorly administered from the outset and became increasingly overcrowded when British troops implemented the internment strategy on a vast scale. Conditions were terrible for the health of the internees, mainly due to neglect, poor hygiene, and bad sanitation. The supply of all items was unreliable, partly because of the constant disruption of communication lines by the Boers. The food rations were meager, and there was a two-tier allocation policy, whereby families of men who were still fighting were routinely given smaller rations than others. The inadequate shelter, poor diet, bad hygiene, and overcrowding led to malnutrition and endemic contagious diseases such as measles, typhoid, and dysentery, to which the children were particularly vulnerable. Coupled with a shortage of modern medical facilities, many of the internees died. Over 100,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were forcibly relocated into concentration camps, where 26,000 died of various causes, mostly starvation and disease. Black Africans in the same areas were also interned in concentration camps as well to prevent them from supplying the Boers. 20,000 died in the camps as well, largely due to the same causes as in the case of their Boer counterparts. After nearly 3 years of intense fighting, during which both sides suffered heavy casualties, the British ultimately prevailed due to their superior resources and tactics. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging on May 31, 1902. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of the British Crown over the Boer republics, while granting significant political and civil rights to the Boers. The Boer War left a lasting legacy in South Africa. It contributed to the unification of the country and set the stage for the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, which brought together British colonies and former Boer republics under a single government. It also left deep scars, with bitterness and division between English-speaking and African-speaking South Africans persisting for generations. Over the years, historians and scholars have tried to take blame away from the British on the motivations and circumstances surrounding the establishment of these camps and the treatment of their inhabitants. Initially, the British portrayed the camps as places of refuge for Boer civilians, particularly women and children, who were affected by the conflict. The British government claimed that the camps were established with humanitarian intentions to provide shelter, food, and medical care to those displaced by the war. Scottish historian Niall Ferguson has also argued that the British no more desired the deaths of women and children in the camps than of the wounded dervishes after Omdurman, or of his own soldiers in the typhoid-stricken hospitals of Bloemfontein. However, as the war progressed and reports of high mortality rates and harsh conditions in the camps emerged, public outrage and international scrutiny grew. In response, the British government launched investigations and made efforts to improve the conditions in the camps. Still, many historians argue that these actions were inadequate and that the suffering endured by camp inhabitants was substantial. It is undeniable that the efforts of the British led to a significant number of women, children, and others, including both Boers and Black Africans, suffering and dying in the concentration camps during the Second Boer War. Regardless of the intentions behind the establishment of these camps, the harsh living conditions, inadequate medical care, and limited resources contributed to a high mortality rate among the camp inhabitants. The British Empire, at the zenith of its global influence, held sway over vast territories and diverse populations across the world. While the British Empire is often celebrated for its contributions to science, culture, and governance, it is also a historical fact that its colonial rule was marked by a range of actions and policies that today are viewed as deeply troubling. The concentration camps during the Second Boer War, with their high mortality rates, are just one example of the contentious aspects of British colonial history. While the British Empire played a pivotal role in shaping the modern world, its legacy is marked by a dark history of exploitation, violence, and oppression in various parts of the world. Other well-known instances of British colonial crimes include the Malayan Emergency. The Malayan Emergency was a guerrilla war between British armed forces and the Malayan National Liberation Army, MLNA, the military wing of the Malayan Communist Party, which began 4 years before Queen Elizabeth's reign and continued 8 years after she ascended to the throne. The MNLA sought independence from the British colonial government and began waging guerrilla attacks on rubber plantations, police stations, and transportation and infrastructure networks. On June 18, 1948, in response to these attacks, British authorities declared a state of emergency, triggering a 12-year-long war and scorched earth terror campaign in which the British military set fire to homes and farmland belonging to those suspected of having ties to the MNLA, relocated an estimated 400,000 to 1 million people into concentration camps called New Villages, and sprayed crops with Agent Orange to starve insurgents. The emergency was declared over in 1960, and by that time, an estimated 6,700 guerrilla fighters and over 3,000 civilians had lost their lives. Military strategists and policymakers still study the Malayan emergency today as one of the few successful counterinsurgency campaigns undertaken by the West. The Bengal Famine of 1943. The Bengal Famine of 1943 is a stark example of the devastating consequences of British colonial policies during World War II. It is indeed a tragic chapter in the history of British colonial rule in India, marked by policies that prioritize the needs of the British Empire over those of the Indian population. Several factors converged to create the perfect storm for the Bengal famine. First, British policies in India had resulted in the exploitation and impoverishment of the Indian population for centuries. The British had imposed a system of land taxation that often left Indian farmers with very little to subsist on. Additionally, the policies of the British colonial administration had disrupted traditional food distribution systems, making the population vulnerable to food shortages. During World War II, the demands of the British war effort led to further economic exploitation of India. British authorities requisitioned rice and other essential foodstuffs from India to feed British troops and the civilian population in Britain and the Mediterranean. This extraction of vital food resources from Bengal, a region heavily dependent on rice cultivation, exacerbated the food shortage. Winston Churchill's role in the Bengal famine has been a subject of controversy and criticism. His decision to prioritize the allocation of Indian-grown food to support British troops abroad, even in the face of a severe food shortage in Bengal, has been widely criticized as callous and indifferent to the suffering of the local population. When hearing about the famine, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the UK, is said to have remarked the following: "The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." The comment attributed to Churchill is emblematic of a broader British colonial attitude of racial superiority and indifference to the well-being of colonized peoples. Such remarks, if accurate, reveal a deep-seated prejudice that influenced decision-making during this critical period. As a result of these policies and actions, an estimated 3 million Bengalis perished during the Bengal famine of 1943, making it one of the most devastating famines in modern history. The historical record paints a stark and unsettling picture of the British Empire's legacy in the countries it colonized, particularly in Africa. It is a legacy stained with the blood of countless individuals who suffered under the weight of exploitation, oppression, and brutality. While today's Britain often proudly touts its commitment to peace and progress, it is essential to remember the darker chapters of its history. The stories of those who endured the British Empire's rule must not be forgotten. These narratives remind us that even nations that profess to stand for justice and equality may carry the heavy burden of a colonial past. Acknowledging this past and its implications is a crucial step towards building a more equitable and just world. By shedding light on the injustices perpetrated by the British Empire, we not only honor the memory of those who suffered, but also underscore the importance of accountability and reconciliation in our shared human history. It is only by recognizing the stains on our hands, both individually and collectively, that we can work towards a future where the lessons of the past guide us toward a more inclusive and compassionate world. This brings us to the end of this video. Tell us what you think in the comment section, as we are always interested in your thoughts. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our video, their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.
Yeah. Back at it.
Back at it like a snack habit.
Yes.
Hey, so I was curious to know, how do y'all feel about this, right? We did the British crusades against slavery, but what about the history of the Arab slave trade? You know, the stuff they don't teach you in school. You know, like this wasn't taught in school. You didn't even know it was. I didn't even know it was the Arab slave trade. But like I said, it goes around the world. But let's see the specifics of this.
Lego. Because this is completely different for me.
For both of us.
Yeah.
To ask him if he had taken any measure. In 1842 CE, the British Consul General in Morocco wrote a letter to the Sultan to ask him if he had taken any measures to stop slavery, or at least slave trade. The Sultan replied that he did not do anything about it because it had been the norm since the time of the sons of Adam, and no sects of Islam are against it. Hence, he will not permit anything that the Quran forbids, and will not make anything unlawful that the Quran has allowed. In the Sultan's reply, we see the simplest justification, or at least excuse, for almost 1300 years of slavery in the Islamic world. This video is part of a bigger collaboration between various YouTube history channels on the topic of Africa. Don't forget to watch the video before this one by Stefan Milo on the Swahili culture. First of all, I've chosen to call this trade the Arab slave trade because Arabs were a key part of this network. Arabs weren't the only people involved in this trade, but still, most of the rulers and raiders involved in the process were Arabs. Most of the important markets were in Arab cities as well. I didn't call it the East African slave trade because it wasn't just done through East Africa. Other trade routes were involved as well. Slavery was already practiced in Arabia and most of the areas that the Muslims conquered in the 7th and 8th centuries. Islam did not abolish slavery, but some regulations were set which were increased upon by the caliphs. There were 4 ways someone could end up a slave. First, a child born to slave parents was a slave.
Okay.
Secondly, someone captured in a jihad against non-Muslims could be made a slave. Third, a slave could be purchased. Or finally, a slave could be given as a tribute. The people living under Islamic rule, Muslim or non-Muslim, could not be enslaved unless they rebelled, or they helped an enemy of the state. Bernard Lewis writes, slaves were excluded from religious functions or from any office involving jurisdiction over others. Their testimony was not admitted at judicial proceedings. In penal law, the penalty for an offense against a person, a fine or bloodwit, was for a slave half of that for a free man. While maltreatment was deplored, there was no fixed penalty. In what might be called civil matters, the slave was a chattel with no legal powers or rights whatsoever. He could not enter into a contract, hold property, or inherit. If he incurred a fine, his owner was responsible. He was, however, distinctly better off in the matter of rights compared to a Greek or a Roman slave, since Islamic jurists, and not only philosophers and moralists, took down accounts of humanitarian considerations. They laid down, for example, that a master must give his slave medical attention when required, must give him adequate upkeep, and must support him in his old age. If a master defaulted on these and other obligations to his slave, the Qadi could compel him to fulfill them, or else either to sell or emancipate the slave. The master was forbidden to overwork his slave, and if he did so to the point of cruelty, he was liable to a penalty which was, however, discretionary and not prescribed by law. A slave could enter into a contract to earn his freedom, in which case his master had no obligation to pay for his upkeep. While in theory the slave could not own property, he could be granted certain rights of ownership, for example, for which he paid a fixed sum to his master. In the Islamic world, various ethnicities were enslaved, not just people of African descent. In fact, they were all considered to have their own advantages. Ibn Batlan, in his handbook, tries to characterize them. He recommends or property as laborers, servants, and eunuchs. He recommends zanj, and as slaves, Turks and Slavs. Yes, even white people could be enslaved. However, there was a distinction between them. The white slaves were called mamluk, or owned, and the black slaves were called abd, which means slave. Where white slaves could rise up to respectable positions, the black slaves could not. The Mamluks had their own dynasties in Egypt and India, but the Abd slaves never did. In fact, even in literature or poetry, we hardly find an example of a black man, slave or otherwise, after the Umayyads. Even free Muslim people weren't all treated fairly across the Muslim world, but as always, there were exceptions. An early chronicler, Jashiari, writes an anecdote about a man called Abdul Hamid, who was apparently the secretary of the last Umayyad caliph. The story goes that the Caliph had received a gift of a black slave from a provincial governor. The Caliph was unhappy with him and told his secretary to write a letter of gratitude and disparagement. Abdul Hamid wrote, "Had you been able to find a smaller number than 1 and a worse color than black, you would have sent that as a gift." This story, along with many others, show that Arabs didn't view African slaves particularly nicely and preferred other ethnicities if they could get them. Even in the times of Prophet Muhammad, Byzantine and Persian slaves were found in Arabia. Africans were just one of various slaves available. However, over time the number of black slaves grew disproportionately. Main reason for that was the stabilization of the frontiers. Turks and Indians started to embrace Islam, and so not many of them could be enslaved. And as jihad slowed down after the 8th century, so did the number of non-white slaves. Mostly against Byzantine and other European states, captured prisoners were ransomed or exchanged. While it's easy to say that the distinguishing factor between slaves and non-slaves was religion and not race, that's not all that true. The ruler of Bornu, for example, complained in a letter to the Sultan in Egypt about how the slave trades were ravaging Bornu and enslaving free men, even members of the ruler's family and Muslims. While it was forbidden to enslave Muslims, in practice, if you were a black Muslim, you could be enslaved. Very early on, the Muslims signed a treaty with Nubia, where Nubia would provide slaves in exchange for peace. This was probably the reason that Nubia was not taken over by the Muslims for quite a while. However, conquests across the Sahara opened trade routes across the African continent. And among the things transported across the routes were religion, ideas, and unfortunately, slaves. Muslim Arabs bought slaves from these routes all across northern Africa and brought them back into the Islamic heartland. This started almost right after the conquests and the subsequent stabilization of the frontiers. The coast of the Zanj, modern Kenya and Tanzania, was used by the Arabs to bring slaves to Yemen, and from there Oman and the Persian Gulf, and cities like Basra and Baghdad is where they were sold to the Muslims. Somalis, before they were Islamized, were...
So what do you think about this?
Jeez. This is deep.
I mean, to have learned that we were enslaving each other, throughout the continent of Africa, but to really see it, because in my mind, I didn't know, we learned a lot about slavery just by doing these videos and how it was a common practice throughout over the world. I kind of knew that, but not to the depth that it was, normal. And now to hear that it was a common practice throughout Africa, it was, and even they had mistreatment of slaves then.
So you thinking that the transatlantic was the only one who mistreated? No.
And even they said black slaves and black Muslims were still being mistreated from other
Arab Muslims. So they didn't favor Arab black Muslims either. So it was
interesting.
And then that's sitting on the same continent that they're saying that, we don't really care for them too much.
Right.
On the same continent, it got nothing to do with the U.S., nothing to do with Caucasian skin. These are all people of color.
Yeah.
So that's showing you like this treatment and this spirit has been going on since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
Because you got to think, man. He said, man, today, so slavery going on back to Adam, man. If you think about it, man, slaves were biblically, that was always there. That's always been there.
Wow.
All descendants of Cain and Abel. All we go down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's just always been there in the lineage of life.
Yeah.
That's so ridiculous too.
Yeah. Wow.
A large number of slaves imported, and later interior peoples were exported as slaves from the Somali coast across into Yemen, and from there via Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad. In Mesopotamia, a large number of Zanj slaves were used in thousands of plantations and saltpeter mines. Apparently, the working conditions were so terrible that they revolted numerous times between 868 CE and 883 CE, and became a serious threat to the Caliphate. This went on for centuries and became a system, but it wasn't as severe as it later grew into. At the time, various African tribes raided each other and enslaved the prisoners, selling them on the frontiers of the Islamic Empire. From here, Arabs took over and took these slaves inland to be sold on the borders, but also in India and across the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, the holiest site in the Islamic world, Mecca, became a bustling market for slave trading. People bought slaves in this market when they visited for Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage. Slaves were brought there as a commodity which could be sold to get some cash. They were easier to protect than other precious commodity in a huge caravan, so people brought them along. People also brought them in Mecca since people from all over the world would gather there. All the way up to 1962 CE, slaves were being sold in Mecca. In The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, John Elambilla Azuma writes the following. The main area from which slaves were drawn and exported to Egypt and other North African Muslim locations and then to the Islamic wider world were the central and western Sudan. The traffic started mainly from Nubia, from which the people living to the south and east of Dongola were taken to Egypt. Slaves were exported also from Kanem Borno via Fezzan to Cairo, Tripoli and Kairouan. People groups living around the Lake Chad area were later exported along this route. While in the 18th and 19th centuries, Bagirmi slaves, especially eunuchs, formed an important part of the slave traffic along this route. Some were later sent from Tripoli to ports in modern Turkey, Greece, Albania, and southern Yugoslavia, which were all at the time under the Ottoman Empire. Slaves from the Middle Niger and the Atlantic coast were also drawn from Gao, Yavargla to Tahret in modern Algeria, and Kairouan, and later from Timbuktu through Tuwat to Tlemcen, Sijilmasa, Fez, and other centers of the Muslim Maghreb, from where some passed into Muslim Spain and Sicily when it was under Muslim domination between the 9th and 11th centuries. Ibn Khaldun testifies to the presence of large slave populations in the 14th century in North Africa, when he wrote that the blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves. Muslim Berber groups of North Africa, like the Tuareg and the Moors, became the chief agents in the raiding and in the traffic of black slaves to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, and the Mediterranean world, some of whom were taken as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber...
Wait a minute. Did he say with the Moors? Let me go back.
The presence of large slave populations in the 14th century in North Africa, when he wrote that the blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves. Muslim Berber groups of North Africa, like the Tuareg and the Moors, became the chief agents in the raiding and in the traffic of black slaves to North Africa, Spain.
So, in Spain, Turkey. You know how, and see, that's a trip, because I used to know people that would want to debate and be like, man, we were Moors. But are you sure? Because the Moors were enslaving, they were part of the whole traffic movement. So how would you be a true Moor if you actually, how can you be a true Moor when you were actually being enslaved? You couldn't be a Moor and be slaved.
But why were they coming to Africa to get slaves, since slavery was still going on all over the world?
They didn't even come to Africa. They were already in Africa.
I know, but I'm saying, okay, so why didn't they go somewhere else to get slaves to bring them back to Africa, since it was a common practice?
Do everybody just got a boat? They got a little jet. You can fly and go get them.
No,
it was right down them lands. They didn't have to go nowhere.
And in the traffic of black slaves to North, okay, I see what you're saying, right, to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, yeah.
Turkey and the Mediterranean world, some of whom were taken as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber Ibadi community of North Africa virtually controlled the trade routes and thus the traffic in black slaves. Considering the terrible conditions on these routes and the increasingly predatory nature of the slave raids, one historian estimates that for every slave that was sold in the market, 10 had died on the way there. These raids were also labeled jihad by raiders to legitimize them. Neither the Muslim raiders nor the buyers of the slaves really cared about who the slaves were and where they came from. The Swahili coast became a bustling hub of slave trading. A network was established across the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. In the 18th and 19th century, when ivory trade was on the rise, these slaves were also forced to carry ivory and other precious commodities on their ways to the markets by the raiders. It was during those centuries that the slave trade reached its peak. From around 1800 CE to 1850 CE, most European countries abolished slavery, and the slave trade started to die on the western side. However, on the east, it was picking up further. The British did try to have countries abolish it, but it didn't work. Not only did it not work, but it probably had the opposite effect. The colonization was taking place, and a lot of these countries exported slaves. Muslim Borno, for example, entered into a trade deal with the Ottoman Empire to provide them slaves. Muslim Africa ravaged the continent and raided deep into it. The stories of these raids are disturbing, to say the least. Most Muslim rulers of the region were interested in slavery because it was profitable. There weren't many advocating for abolition, even though in Europe slavery had mostly died out. The British could not force the rulers to do away with slavery. However, by the end of the 19th century, Africa was almost entirely colonized and the slave trade was put to an end. Muslim states of Middle East were breaking into chaos. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. The Europeans were isolating countries that still practiced slavery. All these factors combined put a slow end to the slave trade by 1950 CE. It was outlawed in Saudi Arabia in 1962.
Dang.
However, slavery in some form is still practiced in CE. An estimated 12 million slaves were traded from Africa to the Americas. In around the same period, 5 million African slaves were traded by the Muslims. However, the Islamic trade existed for a much longer period than the European one, and the total number of slaves traded from 600 CE to 1900 is around 17 million. Thank you for watching this video. This video was just an overview of the Arab slave trade. More videos will follow. As I said before, it's part of a huge collaboration between many YouTube history channels on Africa. So don't forget to watch the video after it about the Great Zimbabwe by history.
Whoa.
Man, that really makes me super sad. I felt like
So would that tell
really
me,
sad.
No, that does make you. And then the music he had playing too.
I know, but it's like, man, they were trading for such a while, long before the Europeans or the British or Christopher Columbus came over there. It was a full-fledged business throughout the continent.
Full-fledged going down. And have you noticed that African tribal, especially tribal or African slaves, like you said, they didn't care where they come from, but they were always saw it as lower form.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Even amongst their own
people. God,
that's sad. Horrible. So that's where the mentality comes from.
That's where the
it
mentality.
It didn't come from Christopher Columbus and the Europeans and people coming over there. If you see, that's why I was like, wait a minute, this is so disheartening.
Oh my God, I just know what you're saying. Oh wow.
This is disheartening because he said they didn't even really care about each other.
Wow, you said that's where the mentality comes from.
Because it started then.
People think it comes from the Western, what was going on in America. That's where the mentality comes from. Slave. No, the mentality came all depth from Africa.
Oh, I felt that in my stomach. I was like feeling so sad. I was like, oh, my chest was feeling, pains literally because I'm like,
bro,
wow.
Many would have knew about this, but who would have thought that that's definitely where that slave mentality comes from, even in this current day, in this modern world with people of our culture, because it's always been there. You've always been even in Africa. There was as lower. You had a lot of people that, especially, it seemed like more on the, as you start going down southern Africa, is where they were just didn't care nothing about them, because it seemed like northern Africa was like doing it different. Those are the Arabs and stuff, but then Southern Africa, they were treating like garbage.
Crap. And then so they already have low morale and low esteem on the continent amongst the wealthy and the poor. And then you have Europeans that come over and really misinterpret and twist up the word of God, and then it really confused the people.
Because what they did was
bamboozled.
Because slavery was like we find out, it's a historical thing, something that's always been there. So people use that in the form to say, God said that you need to be dealt with like this. When actually, even though they were still lower form of slavery in Africa, but then they were taking the words and just rolling it over on that and just thinking that's what God was saying, even though God wasn't saying deal with it in that form.
No.
But it's, I mean, you can't go back. You can never go back in history and say, well, my people are here because we were slaves. No, our people have been slaves for the beginning of mankind. Because when he said about white slaves, he said they got to raise to powers and positions. Black slaves were just like chicklets. That's
why is that? Why is that?
Yo, that got my spirit feeling all kind of way.
Yeah. We gotta do some more. We gotta do some more on this.
It's facts.
I want to see some more of these videos because this
We
is
might
really,
y'all might look. We might have. To
this
be known
is
for,
really an eye opener.
Hold on. We might have to be known for this kind of content.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that now. No,
but
this is I don't doom and gloom.
Not
But
doom and gloom, educational.
it
this
is
a massive education.
Yeah,
boost.
but it's still sad and disheartening to your mindset to really see.
That's how
what
you internalize it.
maybe so.
This is sad as far
But
as the mindset.
this ain't the only content we're gonna be doing.
No, I got it. But this, to me, it's more sad on the mindset of my people in here with when people still say we still had that slave mentality. We have a curse. We had a curse going on for a very long time that's been going on since Adam.
Wow. Yeah. All right, guys.
All right. Like.
Yeah, let's pick up this vibe
subscribe.
here.
Don't take a nosedive, but comment down in the section below if we want some more.
All right, guys. See you on the next video and keep giving us some content to do. We are definitely learning lots of new things. Can't say that I'm liking all the new stuff that I'm learning, but it's really still an eye opener.
But I'd rather this eye opener than just
about
this
the truth.
blanket thought that you always grew up with. That we always grew up with.
True, and you can make then you can really make accurate and rational decisions based off of truths, the real truth and facts. Yeah, that's all right.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy.
Numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, and about 15% of those people died during the journey.
The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic and included many different destinations.
Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I'm a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans who were forced out of their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain started conquering and establishing colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations. However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many of the Indian slaves. This led to a labor shortage in Europe and made the Europeans look towards Africa for a solution. As voyages to Africa progressed, and with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of supply of slaves to Europe. In the Spanish West Indies, as well as the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, the Indian slaves were gradually replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity and occupation. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect, because before being captured by the European, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and many more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and heritage, but when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives and had to be boarded on large ships and taken to Europe. The European slavers dispersed them across the Americas and different parts of Europe. They were forced to lead lives under terrible conditions. and faced severe labor conditions. They were stripped and flogged and forced to work very long hours, often under terrible weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade, although suffering economically, while the other two parts that made up the triangle enjoyed huge economic benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and even native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa, not due to a sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and that they would corrupt the European society and introduce pagan and non-Christian practices to the country. However, over the years, due to economic reasons, there was a U-turn in that decision, and on August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Gouravad to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents and then permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast, and then brought them to the Americas. Generally, the European slave traders did not participate in the raids because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to the widespread malaria infection. So the majority of people that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa that were captured by other West Africans and sold to the Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route, and European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now, let's dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. The triangular trade route is simply the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This triangular trade route across the Atlantic took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of the goods taken to Africa include arms, textiles, and wine. On the other side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The last side of the triangle was the movement of raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton produced on American plantations back to Europe. The triangle involved 3 continents, with Europe providing the capital, Africa providing the labor, and America providing the land and resources. There was always a supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade involves the story of all people in the 3 continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. The voyage is often marked with a lot of difficulties and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost the people being transported as slaves, but in some cases, the crew also lost their lives. The mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions of these ships were inhumane. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters and only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight, and they were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises in the form of dancing to ensure that they were healthy and in good posture when they get to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt, feces, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and a woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. The girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excreta. the slaves suffered from starvation and thirst, and only had 24 ounces of water every day, i.e., the equivalent of 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks and were chained together, hands and feet. The voyage was characterized by many difficulties, and the captives were faced with issues that included epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates. They also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. An estimate by historians put it that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage. The conditions were so severe that only a tiny percentage of the Africans transported in the slave trade came directly to North America. Just about 4% of the total Africans transported, not more than 400,000, arrived in North America directly. A vast majority of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America, and almost half of the slaves that were captured and transported out from Africa, totaling about 5 million, were sent to Brazil. I know you will be wondering how thousands of slaves couldn't overpower hundreds of crewmen. Well, there was one popular situation where African slave trades revolted and took over their ships. The detail of this story is as chilling as it is fascinating. We will get to that shortly, but keep in mind that the slave traders were armed and typically had the slaves in chains before transporting them. Anyways, let's finish up on the journey and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. And while we may think that all slaves transported out of Africa were through the transatlantic route, that is not entirely true. The transatlantic slave only made up for half of the total slaves traded and transported out of Africa. It is reported that from AD 650 to 1900, Islamic traders were also exporting slaves out of Africa and sent out a total of 10 million slaves to Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq. The slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, while some slaves were also enslaved but remained in Africa. Many of the slaves captured and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. The slave activities in this region were excessive, that the section of the African coast in countries like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria was even referred to as the Slave Coast. A majority of the slaves were taken from West Central Africa. In the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally bought Africans who were captured as slaves during tribal wars. But as the demand for slaves increased, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. In the 1690s, the number of people taken out of Africa yearly reached about 30,000, and a century later, the number grew to about 85,000 per year. During the 1700 and 1850, it was estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans were forced into the slave trade, successfully crossed the Atlantic. In the period between 1821 and 1830, about 80,000 people were leaving Africa yearly, and within the next 20 years, before the abolition of slave trade, over 1 million more Africans were sent across the Atlantic to America. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. The Africans were sent to Brazil, were mostly from Angola, and those who were transported to North America, including the Caribbean, were taken mainly from West Africa. Although just about 6% of African captives were sent to British North America in 1825, the US population included about 1/4 of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, the condition of slavery in America was totally different from that in the US. But before we delve into these mind-boggling details, let's talk about the revolt of 1839. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. In 1839, slave traders were once again hoping to get another shipment of slaves across the Atlantic, but unlike previous voyages, they were not ready for the surprise this particular voyage would be bringing their way. The slave ship named Amistad had about 100 slaves on board. As the ship moved near the coast of Cuba, the unwilling passengers of the ship, who were recently abducted from Africa, numbering about 53, revolted aggressively. The revolters were led by Joseph Sink. They killed the captain and cook, and only spared the life of the Spanish navigator so that he can sail them home back to Sierra Leone. However, the navigator managed to sail the Amistad northward. 2 months later, the US Navy intercepted and seized the ship off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut, and the mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut. This event had significant political and legal repercussions in the American abolition movement. At that time, the Spanish embassy demanded that the African slaves are returned to Cuba, and this led to the 1840 trial in Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Louis Tappan was successful in drawing public sympathy to the Africans and was able to battle it with the pro-slavery U.S. government. However, the U.S. president at the time, Martin Van Buren, ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. The interesting part of this incident was the legal proceeding that ensued. The prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to the laws governing conduct between slaves and their masters. Interesting. The trial testimony showed that while slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. The judge therefore ruled that the Africans were not merchandise, but were victims of kidnapping, and so had the right to escape their captors in any way they could. When the U.S. government appealed the case before the U.S. Supreme Court, the following year, former President John Quincy Adams was able to win the court ruling in favor of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the judgment of the lower court through contributions from private and missionary societies. The 35 surviving Africans secured a passage home. They arrived in Sierra Leone in January 1842 alongside 5 missionaries and teachers who later founded a Christian mission in the country. While we could definitely blame the Europeans for the activities of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were also involved in slave trade activities. Africans were involved in kidnapping adults and stealing children for the purpose of selling them. They used European intermediaries or agents to sell off these captives in exchange for merchandise or arms. In most cases, those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group than those who captured them, and it didn't matter if they were enemies or indigenous of a neighboring village. The captive slaves were stripped of any identity they had and simply referred to as other. They were not seen as part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. Also, while African kings were very much interested in protecting their villages, in some instances, thieves and criminals were sold out into slavery as a way to get rid of them. Many other slaves were gotten through raids at gunpoint, which were organized by different ethnic groups, and in some instances, as a joint venture with the Europeans. Also recorded in the book, Daughters of the Trade, Atlantic Slavers and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast, the author, Pernille Ibsen, shared that Africans on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, also participated in the slave trade through intermarriage. The term used was kasari, which gets its origins from Portuguese and means to marry. Kasari was used to form in the initial stages of slave trade. It was common practice for the powerful West African families to marry off their women to the European traders in alliance and to further enforce the syndicate. While the marriages had to be performed based on African customs, the Europeans offered no objection as they were fully aware of how vital these connections were to the success of their businesses. In the initial stages, we may argue that Africans had no idea of the exact condition of the slave trade and the experience of those sold into the slave trade. However, according to Robin Law, there is a possibility that the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom must have had an informed understanding of the fates of the Africans sold into slavery. This is because the King of Dahomey sent diplomats to Brazil and Portugal who returned with information about their trips. Also, some of the elites of Dahomey had experienced slavery in America before returning home. So the only opposition the Kingdom of Dahomey had against slavery was the law that prohibited the enslavement of a fellow Dahomeyan. Anyone caught doing this faced the death penalty. And while the kingdom was against this, they had no issue with the institution of slavery. The case was different on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. Here, elites sent their kids to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans by sailing with them and living inside their forts. Some even sent their children to Europe and America to be educated. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with the Dutch and British governments to rescue some of their friends who were tricked into slavery in America. However, a common assumption by many Africans who were not aware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor even made it more distressing for the captives who were locked in ships sailing to Europe. The transatlantic slave trade in and outside America. A BBC report indicated that more than 1 million people are thought to have died during their transport to the New World. More died soon after their arrival due to terrible health conditions, although the number of slaves that died when bought as slaves is unclear. One thing we are sure of is that this number may exceed the number of those that survived to be enslaved. The Atlantic slave trade led to the destruction of lives and cultures. It is estimated that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, and about 1.5 million died on board slave ships. And apart from those who died in the Middle Passage, it is also estimated that many Africans were killed during the slave raids and wars in Africa. Canadian scholar Adam Jones has characterized the deaths of millions of Africans in this period as a genocide. He referred to it as one of the worst holocausts in human history. Many believed that these deaths were not intentional and it was in the slave owner's interest to keep slaves alive and not exterminate them. Jones argues that the killing and destruction were intentional, whatever the incentives to preserve survivors of the Atlantic Passage for labor exploitation. To revisit the issue of intent already touched on, if an institution is deliberately maintained and expanded by discernible agents, though all are aware of the hecatombs of casualties it is inflicting on a definable human group, then why should this not qualify as genocide? Saidiya Hartman, an American writer and academic focusing on African American studies, argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to the acquisition of profit and the rise of capitalism. She argues that death wasn't a goal of its own, but just a byproduct of commerce, which has the lasting effect of making negligible all the millions of lives lost. Incidental death occurs when life has no normative value, when no humans are involved, when the population is, in effect, seen as already dead. Saidiya Hartman goes on to say that although unlike the concentration camp or the Gulag, the Atlantic slave trade also led to the millions of corpses. In this case, extermination was not the major goal. It was a major corollary to the making of commodities. Who do we blame? While we could blame the Germans for the genocide attempt on the Jews, who do we blame for the slave trade? 7 nations were actively involved in the activities of the slave trade and took most of the slaves to their colonies in the New World. We have the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Americans, and the Danish. The major sources of slaves include Angola Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa, and Indian Ocean Islands, Sierra Leone, and Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also affected how the legal code in Africa worked. According to Kamani Nahusi, many African societies changed the punishment for certain crimes and the way they responded to certain offenders. Some crimes, which were traditionally punishable by some other form of punishment, became punishable by enslavement, and offenders were now sold to slave traders. David Stannard, the author of American Holocaust, showed in his book that 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms, which produced the majority of slaves. The practice of enslaving enemy combatants and their villages was widely practiced in West Africa. Indeed, the slave trade was largely a byproduct of tribal and state warfare. By selling off captives, they were also able to finance future warfare and also remove potential dissidents after victory. However, some of the African nations, such as Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Oro Confederacy, were more brutal in this practice. Truly, it can't take away the fact that the Europeans provided the incentives that made this activity thrive. In one of the letters written by Manikongo Nzinga Afonso to the King João III of Portugal, he writes to the king requesting that the king stop sending merchandise that is fueling the war between the different tribes. He begs the king to stop sending merchandise and rather send more missionaries. In one of his letters, he writes, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom is not a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust over Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them, after having taken these prisoners to the coast, secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron." Despite the vast consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, there have been worldwide apologies from different nations that benefited and grew their economy based on labor from the slave trade. In 1998, UNESCO designated 23 August as International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. This led to several other events that recognized the adverse effects of slavery on the African continent. In 2001, during the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded a clear apology for slavery from the former slave trading countries. Some nations were ready to express an apology. However, the opposing countries, majorly the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, blocked any attempt to do so. The reason for this opposition by these countries could be due to concerns that accepting their involvement in slavery would also require that they make monetary compensations to the affected African nations. Since 2009, there has been a continuous effort by the UN to create the UN Slavery Memorial as a permanent remembrance of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. This video is crazy, but if you want to learn some more Black history that they never taught us in school, click the link in the screen. It's a story I'm sure you don't want to miss. We'll see you over there.
The horrific abuse of black male slaves. In January 1808, the flow of new Africans into the USA and the Caribbean as slaves would stop forever. At the same time, the United States and the Caribbean were undergoing a rapid expansion of cotton, sugar cane, and rice production. The invention of the cotton gin enabled the profitable cultivation of short staple cotton, which could be produced more widely than other types. This led to the economic preeminence of cotton throughout the Deep South. Slaves were treated as a commodity by owners and traders